This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Welcome to Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. I'm Dr. Cinzia Bianco, BIC's Senior Expert on EU Gulf relations, and today we're here with Dr. Tobias Borck, Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security Studies at the Royal United Service Institute in London. Welcome, Tobias, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, Cinzia, thanks for having me.
So today we're going to have a chat about relations between Europe and the Gulf states, in particular the monarchies of the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's becoming a hot topic politically. It has been for a while in Europe, and there's quite a lot happening both at the level of individual European countries and the European Union. Europeans are certainly exploring all sorts of ways and avenues to strengthen their relations to the GCC monarchies for a variety of reasons. We've seen a so-called Gulf strategy published last year in May 2022 by the European Union. That was the first attempt to have a strategic policy document that dealt with the Gulf region in a very comprehensive way and with a clear-cut geopolitical angle, because all of the other documents and policies that were published by the European Union towards the Gulf, since the first one in 1989, the association agreement, were mostly technical or domain-specific rather than having a comprehensive geopolitical overview. However, while we have this growing interest for relations with the GCC countries, it's fair to say, I think, that there are a few challenges. There's some reluctance, there are setbacks, and some of these are old, some of these are new. And it's good to advance the conversation on these topics, which I think would be particularly useful. So let me start with asking you, Tobias, you've also been looking at this topic, the geopolitics of the Gulf region, but also their international relations, both with the United States, with the United Kingdom, with the European Union and other European countries. So let me start by just asking you to give us a quick reaction or sort of a hot take on where do you think things stand right now, over a year after the publication of the EU's Gulf strategy.
Right. I think as you outline in your introduction, that relationship between Europe, and I would say Europe because I would include both the EU and the UK in that, but also, like you say, individual countries too, between Europe and the Gulf states. And again, there, I think we're talking of not a cohesive bloc, but of 6 different ones. I think those relations, they are clearly developing, but it is quite slow. And I think that's a result of the fact that for both sides, I think this is sort of almost a bit of a relationship that is driven by reluctant necessity in a way, right? I think from the European perspective, the Gulf and ultimately the Middle East as a whole is this region that, that there's quite a lot of Middle East fatigue, I think, in Europe, driven by this very intense engagement with the region led by the United States over the last 20, 30 years. And now there's this sense of that there are other parts of the world that are more important, right? That there is, of course, this threat in the East with Russia and Ukraine, but then also that, the Indo-Pacific, that's where the big questions of this century are supposed to be answered. But the Middle East is kind of in the middle. And as the US pulls away, for Europe, it doesn't have that luxury, so it feels the need to engage. There are also big opportunities to engage. So all of that kind of is I think, shaping that European engagement with it. But it all happens in this context of a relationship that is not quite a natural fit, I think. And then on the other side, from the other perspective, I think, from the Gulf states' perspective, Europe is sort of, in a way, the old continent, right? The last time the Europeans were really decisive in the Gulf is, 50, 60, 70, nearly 100 years ago, when the United Kingdom was by far the most important external actor in the Gulf. And of course, those relationships still exist with the UK, with France. And of course, there's also interest in European brands and European technology and the sort of European expertise and having a knowledge economy and all of that kind of stuff. But when it comes to security and defense, the United States remains the most important partner. But there's the concern of the US sort of pulling away. When it comes to economics, China is more important, at least when it comes to just the sheer size of purchases of oil in particular. And when it comes to sort of geopolitical might, I think there is still that sense that Russia still outshines Europe, right? So I think from both sides, ultimately, I think the relationship, there's an interest there, but there's also quite a lot of reluctance there. There's quite a lot of sort of, I think, questions of where it ranks in the priority lists and so on. So I think all of that masks what you outline as I think really rightly as a hot topic. But I think it's a hot topic where no one quite knows just how hot it should actually be.
Yeah, I mean, I really like what you said. It's sometimes it feels like these relations are driven by reluctant necessity. And I mean, what I liked about the EU's Gulf strategy is that I think it was very rare opportunity which they actually seized to define the actual interests that the Europeans have in the region, because up until basically last year, 2022, we were all there wasn't an official definition of where the European interests in the Gulf. And I think, they've done quite a good job into sort of starting from the fact that the EU recognizes the fact that it's a globalized world and that the Gulf sits at the crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa. So connectivity-wise, it is a geopolitical hub, and that's, I think, important to note. And then the EU also talks about trade and investment interests, energy climate interests, security interests, obviously from a very European point of view. When we say security, more of a holistic, comprehensive view of, human security, environmental security, stability, economic security, and so on and so forth, rather than just, hard security. Also, considering the nuclear question, also, nuclear safety is also included in that definition. And then, the document goes on to also add the ways in which the EU can pursue these major interests, and therefore sort of arguing what is needed and in terms of relaunching trade and investment dialogue, but also strengthening and upgrading energy climate conversations, as well as strengthening a European role in this, comprehensive definition of security that they have, including, de-escalation between regional players and the sort of promotion of cooperative security in the region, but then also institutional relations and people-to-people ties. So it is it's a very comprehensive strategy. It covers a lot of ground, but it does, I think, once you read it, it sort of define what the key interests are. And so I want to zoom in on a couple of things, a couple of those interests. And the first one I want to address head on is the energy security interests, because there is this idea I find in the GCC in particular that the renewed European interests towards the region is mostly or even solely because the Europeans needed to diversify away from their reliance on Russian energy. However, I think that's a misconception because, I mean, I definitely know that the EU started writing the strategy well before there was even the idea or the suspicion that Russia would invade Ukraine. So well before 2022. And the initial drivers for the EU to decide to write such document was actually more about, a recognition of US retrenching or retrenching from the region, and the need for Europeans to then step up, because otherwise other players such as Russia or China would fill the vacuum. So obviously, once the idea is accepted and then it enters the EU system, it obviously gets out 2 years later and you are in a different context. And then you have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the strategy was actually ready to be published, but they paused because they wanted to strengthen the energy chapter. And that was to respond to the need to diversify away from Russian energy. So I think energy security interests are certainly important and are certainly a significant driver of this renewed interest, but by no means are they the key drivers or, the initial, I would argue, trigger of renewed European interest towards the Gulf. And also, if you actually look at, what happened on the ground in terms of strengthening energy relations, it's actually been mostly European governments individually rather than the European Union, the DG Energy that has taken the initiative of signing contracts, be them fossil fuels contracts or, agreements for the energy transition. So I would really I think it's from my point of view, it's useful to point out that this was not what initially started this whole interest. But I am keen to hear from you. How do you think the sort of new energy security imperatives have affected the ways that Europeans have looked at the GCC monarchies, both at the EU level, but also individual European governments, including the UK?
Right. I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think firstly, on this question of, whether it's the EU engaging or countries individually, I think that is one of the key tensions in this whole thing, right? Is that because as soon as it's bilateral relationships, what I actually think from the Gulf side is actually more comfortable, right? Not least because the GCC as a cohesive bloc, I think, remains sort of, its future remains somewhat unclear. I'm not saying it will disappear, but its sort of political effectiveness, I think, is in question. So I think on the Gulf side, there's a preference for that bilateral stuff. And then in the European context, I think, there are quite a few countries that are not prepared to wait for finding that degree of consensus. But of course, that's a much wider question about how the EU operates when it comes to its foreign relations. To the wider point on energy, I think you're absolutely right to note that, of course, energy was a driver of this relationship before Putin decided to reinvade Ukraine in February last year. But it clearly has gotten a boost from it. And I think it has changed the conversation somewhat. I think there is clearly a European interest in the Gulf for energy reasons that have nothing to do with the invasion, with the war. They include, an interest in working to put pressure on, engage with, convince these producers of hydrocarbons to ultimately, in the end of the day, reduce their output of hydrocarbons and therefore help decarbonize the global economy. And, we all know that in Europe, when we talk about climate action, there often is this sort of single-minded focus on getting rid of fossil fuels, which is causing quite a lot of tensions in that relationship, I would say. So that's one side. And the other side is to sort of see the Gulf as an area that has quite a lot of potential for renewables, right? So I think that's what the energy discussion was before the war, but then the war has made it more complicated because it has brought the sort of the European need for fossil fuels back into the conversation as well, right? There's a direct need, i.e., lots of European countries sort of going to Qatar and wanting actual physical gas coming from Qatar to power industry, heating, etc., back home. I think Germany is a really good example of that. But there's also, of course, the sort of, recognition that as oil prices go up, we are still living in this world where the first thing that we think about as policymakers in Europe and elsewhere is, well, if oil prices go up, what you have to do is you have to go to the Saudis and try to convince them to pump more oil to bring prices back down. So, that is also something that has happened. And I think, in a way, I think that has shaped perceptions in the Gulf, and we all know that often perceptions are way more important for what political relationships actually are like than what it says in policy documents or what the actual intentions were or something or whatever else. So the perception is that it was not until the war in Ukraine started that folks like Boris Johnson, when he was still prime minister, Macron, Scholz, and Biden too, made their way to Riyadh to talk to Mohammed bin Salman, right? Someone that quite a few of them had pledged in years previous that they would not engage with, right? So that has clearly shaped perceptions, and I think so. Therefore, today we are in this, when it comes to the energy field, in this quite complicated world where there are lots of different and competing pressures, right? On the one hand, we want their physical gas, less so the oil, but we want them to pump more oil so that the price comes down. At the same time, we want them to stop pumping oil in the long run. We want to engage on this renewable fields, and so on. So I think all of that makes it quite complex and quite complicated, and I think is leading to what I think is quite characteristic of that relationship between Europe and the Gulf, which is this sort of, it's never quite clear. You're right to outline that finally we have sort of a bit of a statement of interests. But I think if you dig down into those interests, with some of them, you do sometimes feel a bit like, I can't quite see how these interests are supposed to line up with one another. It's all fine and good to have lots of, we want this, we want this, we want this. But actually, sometimes one sort of contradicts the other quite badly.
Yeah, I mean, I think you outlined very well, sort of the contradictions that one can hear specifically in the energy conversations. And we're going to have another episode on COP28 specifically, and we're definitely, going to dig deeper into before the COP and during the COP, the dynamics that are going to take place. But I do think that, that for Europeans in particular, because they have clear energy security interests, but also climate security interests, and they're both equally strong, I would say, at the political level, then I think it is especially important that Europeans try to arrive at COP28 in Dubai with, sort of a clear idea of what to expect, and try not to get into sort of ideological matches about, fossil fuels and decarbonization.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's really important to note that political level, because I think the hardest part in this whole thing, in a way, is the political context in Europe, right? For many countries, and I would probably take the UK and France out of this a little bit, because those are two countries where I think there is more of a political culture almost of engaging with the Gulf monarchies, right? Whereas in other European countries, there's a lot more reluctance, and I think that reluctance is shaped by lots of prejudice and and stories that we've told ourselves over the last few decades. Also, some that are founded, of course, on truth when it comes to questions around human rights, about the compatibility of political systems, all of those kind of stuff. But I think what that always leads to is these these wild contradictions, right? I think take the German engagement with Qatar during the World Cup, right, where you had the interior minister show up and make this populist gesture, basically with the LGBTQ armband, right? But that was entirely intended for a German domestic audience, right? And then 3-4 days later, they signed a deal for the gas, which in the German media was then, kept quite quiet. So I think you constantly have these strange contradictions, and I think the point is that people in the Gulf see this, and it shapes the relationship. It's this sort of like, well, do you want to talk to us or do you not want to talk to us? Do you want to talk to us only behind closed doors because you don't want to be seen to be talking to us? Because that's not necessarily a relationship that we want, right? And so I think that question of how acceptable, normalized it becomes to talk to the Gulf states as, equal partners, I think remains quite unresolved across Europe. And I think, and genuinely think, until that becomes more normalized, the relationship will always be held back by it.
Yeah. And I mean, you're absolutely right. And, it's been, every day it is pointed out by our Gulf friends that, Europeans seem to have problems talking to some countries whose system they don't share or dislike, but not to others. So, for example, the European Union has signed hydrogen partnerships with a number of African countries that are really problematic when it comes to human rights, and they're really problematic when it comes to political freedoms and civil freedoms, especially their political systems are really far from European liberal democracies. But, they are somehow way more hesitant to be seen, talking to GCC hydrocarbon producers. And also, the GCC interlocutors also often point out that Europeans, by necessity, have to engage quite closely with China. And before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously engaged quite close with Russia. And they're both, not only highly problematic countries in terms of human rights, in terms of political systems, I would argue way more problematic than the GCC countries are, but also way more threatening for Europe. And so when the argument is made that because we now have found out that having dependencies on Russia can be threatening for European security, now we should be careful of having too close of a relationship to GCC monarchies because we don't want to create new dependencies on problematic actors. It makes sense on one hand that we would want to diversify. It is, after all, the key word for everyone, to diversify. On the other hand, the two are not comparable. I mean, depending on Russia is it's a way more threatening actor than depending on Qatar, for example.
And I think you're right on that. And I think one of the bits that I think in the strategy that I think deserves quite a lot of attention is the question around people-to-people ties. Because, like I said, I think that the thing that holds it back is mutual misunderstanding. I think my sense is that many people in Europe do not understand how politics works in the Gulf states. There's this misconception that these are all, dictatorships where one man makes decisions completely without any constraints, and so on, which is, a fundamental misunderstanding. But I think the other way around is also true, right? I think there's also a lack of understanding how politics works here, how politics works in Europe, how different countries have different, political contexts, why a country like Germany will always have a super strong focus on Israeli security, regardless of what kind of politics exists in Israel, right? That is something that you have to understand in order to understand how Germany interacts with the region. You have to understand the political context of a country like, like Italy, like France, like Poland, etc. And I think that bit of mutual understanding what the pressures are, therefore being able to put certain actions, words, etc., into context, and therefore not overreacting to something. Those kinds of things are things that I think are still quite a long way away. Take the European relationship with the United States, for example, right? I think there is so much mutual understanding in terms of like, we understand when these kinds of things are being said, what is being meant by it. Yeah. And I think we're just not there when it comes to the European Gulf relationship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's good of you to highlight that this lack of understanding is also particularly strong in the GCC towards Europe. I mean, it's a struggle to convey some basic differences between European countries. It's a struggle to convey how the European Union works. Why it takes such a long time for the EU to reach to a decision, but why once that decision is taken, you can count on it to be, consistent and firm decision. And, all sorts of, you were saying, the political context, but also societal trends and how things are perceived within the European public, and why that really matters, because the electoral cycles are constant in Europe, be them at the local level, at the regional level, at the country level, at the European Union level. So the electoral cycles are constant, and politicians have to really respond to perceptions within society. And something like the investigation by the Belgian authorities about a suspicion that there was an attempt to corrupt European parliamentarians or officials within the European Parliament by a higher level politician and even a minister from one of the GCC countries was really problematic, because for weeks afterwards, first of all, the media in Europe all focused on this so-called Qatargate. And it became, really the talk of the day. And then obviously politicians had to react. And how did they react? They froze all discussions and policy conversations on anything related to any GCC country within the European Parliament. And this applies to things like, for example, visa liberalization, which must get a green light from the European Parliament to go ahead. And it also applies to trade conversations that also involve heavily the European Parliament to get meaningful process. It slowed down and even, sort of changed the cards of the issue of appointing a special envoy for the European Union to the Gulf. There was a massive delay, and and options were shifted, and sort of it really made an impact. So regardless of the point remains that this is a very sensitive issue, and it plays into existing prejudices in Europe as well. So it was really problematic.
Agreed entirely. Look, I think that there's one thing that I'd wanted to ask you, which I think is still very unclear in my mind. You already outlined in how the strategy or the strategic document sort of outlines, what the European interests are. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about the energy part in particular, and now about this people-to-people relationships in order to reduce that sort of misunderstanding. But I think one part that I'm particularly unclear on is to what extent Europe has in its head, or in its collective heads, it clear as to what it is that Europe has that the Gulf states might want.
Yeah.
Right. I think we talk so much about, and like we say, that the perception in the Gulf is that Europe is there to get energy, right? And for energy security purposes. But it creates this sort of slightly interesting imbalance, right? Between here come the Europeans asking for something. But what do the Gulf states want from Europe? And to what extent is Europe clear about what it is that they have and what can give it that confidence? Because I think once those kinds of things are clear, you are also slightly better at navigating these more political elements of the relationship, right? If you are clearer about what it is that you're offering. Do you have a sense as to what extent Europe has that clear?
I think, from a European point of view, it is quite clear what they think they have to offer. I mean, they, if you look at, for example, the people-to-people chapter, which we talked about, Europeans are really sort of quite self-confident that the lifestyle that we enjoy in Europe is sought after really in the rest of the world, and sort of access to this lifestyle through an easier way of getting visas, for example, but also the possibility to attend universities in the European Union through sort of an extended version of the Erasmus program, where you have exchanges of students, but also exchanges of professionals, of researchers, of scientists, and sort of that know-how of a cultural offering that the Europe has is a central, I think, value that Europeans think they have and they can share. And then obviously, there is the idea that because Europeans have this approach on security that is really holistic, that we really are the go-to interlocutors for regional actors that want to build a cooperative system on security, and one that is comprehensive and looks at the different dimensions of security. And then if you look obviously at trade and investment, Europeans do think that the assets we have in Europe, not just in the European Union, but in Europe, should be among the most desirable assets to invest in. And the market that the European Union has in terms of a trade partner is definitely is. That's a numerical issue. It's among the top 3 markets in the world. And so to have easier access to that, both for import and export, is extremely valuable. Having said that, I take your point that, first of all, when Europeans are not really good at communicating these are the things that they have to offer, because they take them for granted that everyone in the world sees the value of that. But also, I think they're hesitant to promote that these are the things that they have to offer, because there are a number of question marks as to what extent they're able to offer those things to external partners, not just in the GCC or in the Gulf, but just more widely speaking, because as Europeans, we do have a lot of constraints. And so, for example, I want to quickly switch to another issue, which is trade and investment. You sit in London. The British government has been exploring options for a free trade agreement with either bilaterally with one of the GCC or some of the GCC monarchies, or collectively with the GCC. And I understand that they're further along in the conversation that the European Union is, because the EU has a lot of constraints into, discussing an FTA with the GCC. And they, range from industrial interests to human rights concerns, and, human rights clauses are, you can't avoid them. They must be in any FTA signed by the European Union. But also the carbon border adjustment mechanism, a new form of constraint, if you look at relations with the hydrocarbons producers, that is basically a carbon taxation. And it would, go directly in contrast with the idea of liberalizing trade, especially with, again, fossil fuels producers. So let me ask you to give me sort of a view from London on this question of free trade.
Right. I think from the UK side, free trade agreements are sort of the answer to Brexit, right? And therefore, it's an incredibly political issue. The Brexit campaign promised that there would be, free trade agreements like there, sand at the beach. But obviously, things are more complicated. And I think when it comes to the particular UK with the GCC states, there is still, the number one approach remains we want a trade deal with all six together, UK, GCC, that it should be that, which from the UK side, I think makes sense because there is this sort of notion of, well, all six countries together still have a smaller population than the United Kingdom. Their economies are smaller, and therefore it would be more of a balance. But of course, politically, certainly from the other side, it does not look balanced at all. And it is further complicated by the fact that, if you wanted some kind of free trade agreement between the UK and the GCC, you're also going to be hampered by the fact that, the GCC states themselves struggle with removing certain constraints between each other, and arguably the trajectory is going towards more protectionism rather than less within the GCC context too. So I think all of that makes it quite complicated. It is also, I think, here in the UK, an increasingly bigger question to what extent it would really create the political win that would justify giving up various different things, right? Sure, I think that the Conservative Party, the party of government, is clearly interested in finding political wins at the moment, not least because there will be an election over the next year or a year and a half. But I think it's quite unclear as to what extent a trade agreement with the GCC would be such a political win at this point. So all of those kinds of things, I think, make it more complicated. I think, as you can hear from what I'm saying, it's primarily about politics. That is my sense anyway. And it's about that question as to how do things actually fit. And I think there's a sense that they don't quite at this point, and that neither side is willing to make those final steps to make them fit. Because it is not, seen as politically valuable enough to invest that kind of capital to make it happen.
Yeah, I think it is, as you say, it is really complicated. And also, I think the question you raise is, what is the political value of getting to an FTA agreement with the GCC countries, but also what is the economic value of getting an FTA with the GCC countries? And then, with shifting sense, how to approach the question of getting more oil and gas from the GCC countries, but then, you don't really want to include that into an FTA, obviously, but at the same time, because you have also, from a European point of view, you also have CBAM, and then a number of questions on also investments, liberalization. So, for example, there's a lot of interest, I think, in Europe to invest in some of these countries as they do their economic diversification strategies. So, for example, definitely in Saudi Arabia for Vision 2030, it is certainly perceived as a clear-cut opportunity for Europe, but also at the same time, there are questions that are being still discussed in terms of, for example, the question of reshoring. So to what extent would Europeans have to focus on investing within Europe, within the continent, to sort of move along on the way and the pathway of so-called de-risking from risky investments in countries where you don't have exactly the same political alignment. And I would just mention, there's a lot of controversy in Europe about some of these GCC countries' relations with Russia. and the fact that some of these countries are considering to be or to some extent have functioned as re-export hubs between Europe and Russia. So from their point of view, obviously they're not doing anything illegal because there are no secondary sanctions on re-export towards Russia. But from a European point of view, that is obviously problematic. And again, it raises questions.
I think you're absolutely right. I think, look, there seems to me one obstacle, which is that we actually see the world quite differently at this particular point, right? I think Europe, the West more generally, I think is in this mindset that we are moving into a more competitive global order that is ultimately, leaning towards maybe a multipolarity, but within that multipolarity, I think quite a clear bipolarity. There's quite a clear sense of us versus them, whether that is West versus East, whether that is democracies versus non-democracies, whatever, right? And within that, there is clearly a European and a Western sort of view towards, as you say, bringing things home, reducing complexity to supply chains, or at least bringing supply chains into a less politically risky space. The Gulf states, on the other hand, all of which are, busy with their domestic diversification strategies, and I think, actually for the first time in decades, really, we can quite seriously say that they're all serious about their diversification strategies and really are making those big pushes. But I think their political models are still very much about a globalized world, a globalizing world, because that's where their strength lies, right? They are, as you said earlier in, I think, the introduction, they are, all about connectivity, about connecting players that don't want to talk to each other, about connecting different parts of the world, about a multipolar order in which we don't let politics get in the way of trading with one another, right? Which I think those two approaches are actually quite contradictory. And if they are thought that to their sort of endpoint, they are incompatible. So I think that remains an obstacle as well. It's quite a sort of, strategic level obstacle, but I think it's one that shapes what is and isn't possible at this point. And it, for that matter, it also brings it back to that question of understanding, right? Of mutual understanding. It's not just about, do we actually understand how each other's countries work? It's also about, do we understand how we each see the world, right? And how we see where world politics is headed.
Yeah, I completely agree. But I'm increasingly thinking about something else, which I quickly want to pose to you as a last question. I'm thinking, regardless of the fact that, exactly like you described, the GCC countries are looking at keeping the world globalized and connected and continuing to, prosper in a multipolar context where sort of interests come first and politics comes second, then, they wouldn't be able by themselves to resist forces of increased tensions, which we are objectively seeing. I mean, the tensions between the US and China are growing. And that is not something that the Europeans want, by the way. They are just witnessing these tensions grow and grow. And at some point, they could get out of control. So I'm also thinking that, if in this context where neither the Europeans nor the GCC countries can really do that much to prevent tensions from rising between the two bigger players, or, as we have seen, they can't even sort of convince Russia to walk back its disastrous invasion of Ukraine, despite the harm that it is doing to globalization. I think that these two players which remain, in geographic proximity, and both have an overriding interest of stability, do have still something in common. They could be, with some creativity and some really strong pragmatism, they could become a de-risking interlocutor and partner for one another. At least, in some domains and in some ways. And if you try to look for, who's your safer partner that is sort of trying to also resist being dragged into more and more polarization, and it also has its own feet to stand on, then probably, you are looking at each other. Europe can find an interlocutor in the GCC, but most importantly, the GCC countries can find an interlocutor in Europe. And, just very quickly on a practical point, think about 5G, for example. You have the Chinese option, which is obviously very, very problematic. You don't really have a US option. You do have a European option that is, sort of your safe bet in a way. It becomes your safe bet in a way. So do you think that this could happen in the short to medium term future?
I think what you outline makes sense. The problem that I see is that both the GCC and ultimately, let's widen it to the Middle East, right? The Middle East and Europe are both, at least in geopolitical terms and hard security terms, somewhat weak actors that have dependencies, particularly on the United States, right? The European security remains dependent on the United States. And what we're seeing in Ukraine, what we've seen with US support for Ukraine, which I think has been obviously absolutely essential to helping Ukraine withstand that Russian onslaught and potentially start turning the tide as well, and to shore up European security. I think, the last 2 years have really shown to what extent European security is still reliant on the United States. And I think in the Gulf, it's quite similar, ultimately, right? There, the US has shown that it is not willing to go to those lengths to provide that security anymore, perhaps. Or I think that's at least one of the conclusions that the Gulf states themselves have drawn, right, with the Iranian attack on Abqaiq in 2019. So there's a shift there. But I think we are sort of in this complicated world where we all still know where our bread is buttered, and that is in Washington when it comes to security. And so coming up with some form of alignment that is explicitly not with Washington, I think is quite difficult for both sides. Obviously, a lot of that depends on US politics, which I think there we definitely share a lot of concerns in Europe and in the Gulf and the wider Middle East. Not necessarily for the same reasons, but we do share that sort of sense of that US politics swings like a pendulum ever more extremely from one side to the other. I think there's a sense in Europe that, if there is a return of a Trump administration or something similar, that could undermine the transatlantic relationship, and that could become a driver towards a more clearly defined European policy, including with regards to the US-China relationship that is different from Washington. But as long as that extreme scenario doesn't exist, I think Europe will be quite careful not to define those, especially those big geopolitical questions, in opposition to the United States. And I actually think in the Gulf we're in a quite similar situation, because I think whilst there is, of course, lots of talk of how Saudi Arabia, the UAE, others have been willing to go quite far in their relationships with Moscow and with Beijing, I think they too still are also quite careful to retain their close links to the United States, right? I think we have not yet come to that absolute crunch point where the United States says, you do this or something bad happens, and then a Gulf state says, fine, we'll do it anyway. I don't think that has happened just yet. And I don't think those the sort of controversies that we've seen over the last year or so about OPEC, production reductions and stuff like that, I don't think those kinds of things have reached that very high strategic level just yet. Yeah. We might see it in the next few years, but I think we're not quite there yet.
Yeah. I mean, and the one that you just witnessed, ladies and gentlemen, is the perennial debate in Europe, whether, how close of a relationship we do have and we want to have with the United States today and tomorrow and going forward. Is there a European third way? Is there European strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty? I think we can agree that the answer to those questions is not yet, but there certainly is an ongoing debate about whether we are already starting to build that and how we would do that. Let me thank you, Dr. Tobias Borck, for joining us, and let me also plug in your upcoming book, Seeking Stability Amidst Disorder, out in September 2023 by Hearst, and I'm certainly looking forward to read that, and I really recommend it to all those who are listening. Thanks really for your time today. We've had a very comprehensive conversation and covered a lot of ground, but I guess that sort of reiterates the importance of these relations between Europe and the Gulf and how they are connected to many other global questions and many other topics.
Thank you so much for having me, Cinzia. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.